Not every book has been equal in its impact on who I've become as a person. And I would actually like to add on to that, a lot of the books that have had meaningful impacts on my life aren't necessarily self-help books. They are books that would probably be read by academics or people who read nonfiction, like the quote-unquote serious nonfiction. And it's the frameworks that I derive from these books that then inform the decisions I make into the future, which have had a grander or better impact on who I've become as a person. So I want to share some of these books that I've read that have had a meaningful impact on my life that aren't necessarily self-help books. So some of those books, or all those books, are here. I'm going to start with Objectivity. Objectivity, this is a book about the expression or the phrase objectivity. I read this book when I was maybe first year of college. God, I read this book at least 12 years ago now. Very long time ago. And what was great about it is it walks you through not like someone's conceptualization of objectivity, but how it's been used historically speaking through different societal contexts. Much to not my knowledge, much like unknown to me, there was a time where objectivity was used as a way of drawing something. So like a sketch artist or like a person who's really good with using a pencil would draw images of nature, and those would be considered objective. And so objectivity was used in that sense. And then there was another time when Kant came along and used objectivity to mean mind independence. And by the mind independence definition, even a depiction of reality itself would not be considered objective. Mind independence means it's not dependent on your representation of the world. And those are, there's another, I forget it, but there's another usage of objectivity in this book as well. But the idea of exploring objectivity like that was rather new to me. And I think beforehand, before I read this book, from what I remember was I went into this book as a realist. I had this idea that what is objective is what is a fact, and what is a fact is like what is basically perceivable reality. But yeah, this book really exposed me to a different notion of objectivity, of like mind independence, and it really helped me compare and contrast how these concepts were used. I also like that it didn't do it like in an argumentative way. It simply gave a descriptive account of how different scientists and philosophers and professions use the word objective, as opposed to giving rational or coherent arguments for one usage rather than another. It was purely descriptive. So this book definitely changed my life. I will always recommend people read this book. It is a great book. Zone Books has a bit of a small publisher, and they have a lot of little esoteric books that deal with social issues or social topics as well. So interesting publisher if you want to check them out. The next one, we're going to do this one. So if you've been following me for a while, you know I've recommended this book before. It's The Concept of Law by H.L.A. Hart. H.L.A. Hart is a jurisprudence theorist. Isn't jurisprudence defined? I think that's redundant. He basically is a guy who does jurisprudence work. It's philosophy of law, for people who don't know that word. And he has a lot of books that are really interesting. This one, to me, was probably his best work. I haven't read all of his works, but I think this is his best book. And it goes over like the reasons as to why we need a legal system and what it means to actually have a legal system. Because arguably there's a meaningful distinction between simply having a set of rules and having a legal system. So he goes over that like kind of philosophy behind this stuff. But the reason why this book changed my life is because it really made me understand, like beforehand I understood societies had rules, there's people in power who implemented those rules. But I really began to understand that it's not just rules. There are meaningful differences between the systems, the different legal systems between countries. This book actually got me into comparative law. And it also made me very apparent. It made apparent to me the fine line between different categorizations in law, especially when it comes to acts that you commit and that you can be culpable for. So the difference between, say, like, say you falsely imprison someone versus just assaulting someone. There's a very fine line that can be crossed there that you might not even intentionally cross, but it's a very fine line. And the second you go from just hitting someone to forcefully restraining someone in a location, it's a line that you can cross unwittingly. Same thing holds true for, like, if you just have an altercation with someone, you're yelling at someone and you spit at them, it's very easy to then get into areas of being going into assault. And there's what made me realize this is there's a chapter in this book that talks about the difference between like a command, a demand, an order, and then it goes into another one was what was it? Demand, command, order, and coercion. I think these four. He goes into the minute distinctions between these four, and goes into like what's lawful, what's unlawful. And I was just like, wow, it's I mean, this and talks some case law as well. It's so easy to become culpable, because the reasoning that's used in jurisprudence is so fine and like detailed that our macro everyday choices are so muddy, and they overstep so many boundaries that we just fall into all these different categories legally because their legal categories are so fine, like minute and detailed, right? So that for this reason, this book changed my life, and it made me much more cautious about decisions I make that involve the law, so that I'm not held culpable in the future for something that I didn't think about, because it was, again, just something it's very easy to make a mistake on. Yeah, H.L.A. Hart, Concept of Law book definitely changed my life. Another. Okay. Money changes everything. This book changed my life in the way I understand finance. Before I read this book, oh, this book's damaged. Wow, what the hell happened? Did someone bite my book? Oh my god, did my dog bite my book? Anyways, before I read finance or studied finance, or in particular this book, I always thought it was something related to companies and government policy. But this book takes a much grander scope on the nature of finance. In fact, the subheader of this book is How Finance Made Civilization Possible. And it shows how fundamental financial institutions and instruments are for the development and maintenance of modern societies. Historically speaking, obviously, I mean, Adam Smith had already introduced me to like the common medium of exchange, that you need money to do bartering. But this book argues that it's not even just money, you also need things like debt. He gave the famous example of, I believe Seneca would actually loan out money to people who built boats. And Seneca would be like an insurer. He would insure the boat. He would say, okay, I will insure the boat, but if I'm insuring the boat, you give me profits. So Seneca would put up a large sum of money. The people who built the boat would then go sail and come back with the goods and sell the goods, and the profits would go, some of it would go to Seneca. But if you're someone who simply builds the boats, you don't want to have to rebuild the boat every time, because you're going to be someone who sails, right? So you want to separate the labor. So you hire someone who builds boats, and since it's expensive to build the boats, if you're just someone who sails, you're out of a job You're out of a job if the boat breaks. And the boats did break. It was common for them to get wrecked back then. So in order to make this sustainable, people who had money had to take on risk for international trade. They were forced to take on risk. And taking on risk, this idea of having an investor take on risk, or having a company take on risk, is so foundational to everything in our society. It's everywhere. And in fact, if you look at modern day states, most of them have like a debt to GDP ratio. Like America's debt to GDP ratio is 128%, right? I think France is 98. Germany is 67, but it's projected to go up to 74, some argue. Countries have a lot of debt, and it's because, one, they're also leveraging. Debt is a good way to... Oh, my phone's ringing. 1 second. Sorry about that. So I was on debt, yeah. Debt can be used as a way to engage in development, and if the development is a productive form of development, then you can pay off the debt in the future, right? Whereas sometimes if you get into debt and you do development and the development is not productive, then the debt cannot be paid off. There's that part of debt, but then there's also a part of debt that comes from people taking on risk, right? So yeah, it's just how fundamental finance and financial institutions are to modern society is eye-opening for me, and it's changed the way I viewed society and I've even engaged with society. There's definitely been investment decisions where like I'll look at someone's debt and I'll find, okay, well the debt is being put to productive use rather than just like artificial use, and things that don't, like maybe like real estate. Real estate's not a productive asset in my opinion, but yeah, my investment decisions have basically been informed by just this change in worldview, and it helps you understand society a lot better. Even it leaks into politics. There are some political views that don't want debt-based economies. They don't want people to be leveraging their money, and I disagree with that because it's important, it's fundamental. I'm not going to ramble here anymore. This book changed my life. Next, okay. Okie dokie. AP Matriarch's Philosophy of Language and Anthology. There's a newer edition. I had this one for a Philosophy of Language class, and it was such a great book. Now, the reason why this book changed my life, and it will change your life, is because it helps you understand the nature of language much more thoroughly. What I like about like a philosophy of language is that it will teach you all the general areas of like the nature of language. And if you take a linguistics course, what you'll instead be receiving is a more practical understanding of language, and they might even actually go towards syntax, which is arguably less practical, but it's more like modeling oriented, whereas this is more like what is the nature of language in general, such as, for example, speech acts. John Searle's famous essay on speech acts is in here. Like when someone apologizes, it's not simply an utterance. There are utterances that can be said that actually are behaviors that are meant to be as apologies. So speaking can be a behavior, and you can't interpret the literal expression of the words because there's the context of the human behavior. And so let me just give you an example. If someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, I didn't mean that," and they don't say, "I'm sorry," well, the behavior of them coming up and saying, "Oh, I didn't mean that," can be a speech act. It is a behavior in conjunction with speech that is meant to be an apology. And so an apology can be a speech act. Another one of these might be like if someone says like, "What's up?" This is like a speech act where it's like a greeting, although the literal meaning of "what's up" is it's not a greeting, right? That's just one instance. There's also like propositional attitudes, definite descriptions. There are so many topics delved into in philosophy of language that it will really help you analyze people speaking better, but also the writing inside like legal documents or financial documents like contracts. These ideas from this book are terrific, and they will change the way you view language, and because we are humans who talk to one another, it will therefore change your life. Now, another one that I found really, really good was the bluezones solution. There are a few reasons why, and usually when you talk about dietetics with people or like nutrition science, everyone has an opinion, everyone has their own studies, everyone has critiques of studies, right? There's this famous debate of carnivorism versus veganism and what the carnivores will ultimately say, because there's lots of studies now that have controlled for hundreds of variables, maybe not hundreds, maybe like 40 or 50, where they find that even like, there was a recent study that vegans had 7% lower relative risk for heart disease. Not an absolute, it's a relative risk reduction. And things like gum disease, so on and so forth, that vegans had better outcomes on. The response I've always been told was that there's been no carnivore study which deals with like people who are eating meat that is basically not like factory farmed or like low quality meat. There's no study that really looks at carnivores who are eating high quality meat. Okay, that's a fair point, and maybe like this will change the outcomes, but even then, like the practicality of going to eat these high quality procured meats is questionable. It's easier for me to go get a bunch of veggies than it is for me to get high quality meats. But the point being was that this book says, okay, look, let's be honest about dietetics and nutrition. We don't know what's going to work. There's so many studies that say one thing, so many studies that say another thing. What he decided to do is go to the blue zones, look at exactly what it is they're doing, not just in their diet and their lifestyle, and copy to a T what it is they are doing. So much so that there's some things even in this book that I'm like, come on, is that really a contributor? One of the things was like going to, I think it was like a Sunday church thing, like a gathering. And I'm like, is that really why these people are living to 90? But the philosophy behind this book is do what these people are doing independent of what you believe is true. And I think that is a valid thing to say. Whether you find it persuasive or not, I don't know. But since then, I've basically done this, right? Like, since reading this book, I drink more tea now. I probably drink 3 or 4 green teas or herbal teas a day, in addition to the black coffee that I have. I don't sit as much. I sit a lot less than I used to. I actually got like a smartwatch to track my steps, because people in the blue zone take probably about like 7,000 to 9,000 steps a day. People in America take about 3,000 steps a day. People in the blue zone don't do all-out exercising. They just are constantly busy every day. So what I do now is I'll do 15 minutes of maybe weightlifting or cardio in the morning. I don't do these 45-minute, 55-minute chest, back, legs, pull, push days. I don't do these anymore. I just do 15-minute weightlifting, 15-minute cardio maybe every morning. And I do actually like that. I feel better doing it. I don't overeat. People with the blue zone, they don't overeat. Even if it's healthy food, they don't overeat. They don't eat simple sugars or processed foods. Again, so don't eat that stuff. Maybe once in a while I'll eat that stuff. So maybe I won't live till 99. But basically this book changed a lot of how I live my life. And for that reason, I think this is a book that will also change your life. So this next one is actually kind of cheating. It's 2 books, but to be fair, each chapter in one of these books covers a completely different country, but they're the same general idea. And the general idea is that geography has a deterministic influence on the development and nature of countries. The Tim Marshall's Powers of Geography and Prisoners of Geography, I'm sure you're well aware of them. And the reason why these books can change your life is because it really bakes into your idea that the outcomes of a group of people might not actually be a result of the people themselves, but instead the geography. The best example that he probably gave of this was in Spain. Catalina produces 18% of the GDP of Spain. And this isn't due to any differences between people in Catalina and other parts of Spain. It's because the geography is much more favorable. The same thing holds true with certain countries in Africa, certain countries in the Middle East, certain countries in Asia. Even in Canada, the reason why Canada is not as wealthy as America is because all of our natural resources they're in colder parts of Canada. And as Canada gets warmer, we'll be wealthier. But also, in addition to this, the country, because it's so cold, can't even support a population as big as America, because people don't want to live in the cold as well. That's another thing, right? And so because our population is smaller in Canada, we can't have as much wealth as America. America has 300 million people. Canada has I think 35 million. So yeah, the geography has a deterministic influence on the nature of a country. And as a result, you need to take that into consideration when you're looking at the achievements of any one country. Some people were born in a harder situation. Some people were born in an easier situation. And to simply say that, like for instance, that America's hegemonic influence in the world is solely due to American competency is not a wise take. I would agree with Adam Smith that if America ever falls, it's because the people are dumb. They were born with like a silver spoon, so to speak. They have lots and lots of natural resources, and their neighbors are very cooperative with them, and they also have lots of natural resources. Again, geography has a deterministic influence on things, and that should change how you view the achievements of nations. Now, another one that was really influential for me, actually, when I was like 18, I really struggled with this concept, but not anymore. It's the idea that there's a human nature, and the reason why this is important, it's not like to prove that there's a human nature. It's to prove that, one, there's human nature, but what that means is, two, humans are infinitely plastic. So you can't, for instance, through centralized policy, change everything about humans. The government just can't will things into existence. Some things will be resisted by human tendencies, right? That's just a fact. The invisible hand has a limit, and that it has to be in alignment with human nature. And this should change the way you view interpersonal relationships as well, because it's one thing to think about government policy, but it's another thing to think about individuals. If there is a human nature, then that means that you can't change people individually to an infinite level of plasticity. You just can't. You have to be able to accept at some point that there is something about someone in your life that you cannot change, and you will not change, because they have a human nature. There is something about them that is not susceptible to being changed. That's what makes us humans, after all, right? We're not chairs. We're not dogs. We're not elephants. We're humans, right? A giraffe. Steven Pinker has this famous quote. He says, "There's nothing you can do to make a giraffe learn calculus. Even if you take him from day one and start trying to teach him calculus, he simply is missing the hardware to learn calculus. It's not going to work." That's his argument. Practically speaking, we ever going to do an experiment like that? No. But if I had to bet $1 million on the outcomes of such an experiment, my bet would be, a giraffe's not going to learn calculus, right? That's a pretty pragmatic or intuitive, common sense thing to say, I would agree with. So for that reason, this book changed the way I view my social relationships, but also government policy. Now, this last book, this was a really, really big thing for me. So I really like Leonardo da Vinci. I like that he's a generalist, someone who does multiple studies. I like that this book basically kind of removes the idealism, romanticism that surrounds Leonardo da Vinci, right? A lot of people will say that Leonardo da Vinci was always a workaholic. Were there times where he was working more so than the average person? Yes. Were there times where he was lazy and not doing anything? Yes. Was he a really, really smart guy? Yes. Did he know everything? No. There were times where he wouldn't paint for months. Even when he had a contract and was paid to paint, he would just spend the person's money, and then when they came around to give him the second payment for completion, to basically say, "Okay, is the artwork done?" He'd be like, "No, it's not, but give me more money." And on top of that, there were also things in his notebooks that he would go and learn that were basically rudimentary to anybody else at the time. He would learn very, very basic mathematics. He would go and learn very, very basic facts about physiology or biology. He would just go out and learn these basic things with an open mind. And that really, really changed the way I view Leonardo da Vinci, and therefore most likely other smart people. Since I've started reading biographies in general, I realized that these people who are great achievers and really smart are riddled with flaws. They never live up to the romantic image that you get in the culture that basically portrays them, and they're always just short of what people expect them to be. Kind of humanizes them. It makes them more human. And because now that you understand that they're human, it kind of changes the way you view your own self, and saying that oh, okay, in order to achieve meaningful and great things, you don't actually need to be this super freak, right? Einstein wasn't this super freak who could just do everything. His thought experiment for light was literally almost verbatim copied. People debate this actually, but the Walter Isaacson biography talks about how Einstein's light experiment was very, very, very similar to a science article that was published by a doctor who used to tutor Einstein, if I'm recollecting properly. But Einstein definitely read this article nonetheless, and it's almost identical to his thought experiment about light, right? So Einstein didn't just produce this out of pure intellect. He most likely sampled from other elements in culture. And there are tons of examples like this. The point being is that all the people we admire in history and through culture are not what the romantic image is, and that should change how you view yourself, because you're going to compare yourself to them, and therefore it will change your life. So those are some of the books that I've read that have had a meaningful impact on me. There are of course others, But I figured let's do some reflection, let's deal with some of these. I've probably talked about some of these before. If there are some books that you could recommend that have like a meaningful impact on your life that aren't necessarily self-help, they could be nonfiction. I'd actually prefer them to be serious nonfiction because these were serious, like quote-unquote serious nonfiction, and they definitely had a meaningful impact on my life. If you have some of these books, I'm definitely open to hearing about some of them. I do book shopping routinely. And with that being said, bye-bye.